Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all here. There's a few more people just joining. Let me let them in. Welcome to the Goldster Inside Story. This is great. Oh, more people coming in. Hang on a minute. I'm really thrilled today to introduce you to Thomas Mogford, who has written a new book under the name T.L. Mogford, because he's got a new identity as historical novelist, as well as Thomas Mogford, which is the name under which he wrote crime fiction. Thomas, welcome. It's so lovely to have you here on Goldster. We've got more people coming in thick and fast. So as you know, Goldster is all about healthy aging, and reading is a vital part of healthy aging. So I want to talk to you actually about your writing career in general. We're going to come on to the Plant Hunter later, but I want to know how you got started, because we've got quite a few people here who are doing a writing course on Goldster and are starting to write. How did you get started? Did you always want to be a writer? Was it something that suddenly came to you in a blazing flash, or was it just by accident?
Hello, everyone. Yes, I think I always wanted to be a writer, but I thought it was a completely impossible dream. I never thought it was achievable. And it was a good friend of mine at university, and we used to talk all the time about how great it would be to write a novel, and how it might feel to go into a bookshop and see your own novel on the shelves. And it was sort of almost a fantasy. And then we left university, and he suddenly sent me a message saying, I've started writing a novel. It's doable. It's not as impossible as we assumed. And he said, I'm doing 1,000 words a day. I calculate the novel might be 60,000 words, so I should be done by August the 4th. And my eyes kind of opened, and I thought, well, if he's doing it, I'll give it a go, and we'll see what happens. And this was quite a while ago. So I started writing, and I was quite sort of disciplined in this 1,000 words a day thing. And sure enough, lo and behold, I had a novel, a piece of fiction. I could write my name on it. So that was my first ever novel, called The Honey Trap. And I then sent it to some friends, and they were quite complimentary. And then I started sending it to agents, and they were less complimentary. They sort of responded largely with either a wall of silence or some standard rejection letters. This was in the day, sort of almost pre-internet submission days. So I thought, well, I'll write another one. And that went on for a number of years. I wrote 5 novels before my first novel was published. So it was a long process.
Oh. So tell me, those 5 novels, have they ever been published, or are you going to go back to them and look at them? Do you think they're something you've completely left behind, or what?
Well, it's a great question. I sort of part of me fears going back and looking at them. If I suddenly think they're extremely good, then I might feel depressed that I've actually got worse. If they're appalling, which I suspect is more likely, then it might just feel embarrassing. So no, I think I think they sit in a very full desk drawer, but there's no doubt that parts of them I've used again. And it was a kind of, I suppose, rather than doing a creative writing course, it was a sort of a self-inflicted process of apprenticeship.
Yes, that's just thinking that sounds like an apprenticeship. Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly ups and downs, because a great deal of time went into these books. And I think the first one, I was just amazed to have completed the book. And then as I wrote more, I felt they were probably getting better. And a couple of them, got tantalizingly close. And it did certainly reach a point when I thought, this is just, it is impossible, particularly as the friend from university had his novel published.
Are you allowed to tell us who that is? Would we recognize?
Yes, he's still a very good friend, and I was thrilled for him, and am, though there was a flickerings of the green-eyed monster, I have to confess. But he's called Lewis Crofts, and he wrote a novel about Egon Schiele, the painter.
Oh wow, yeah.
And it was successful actually. And
I've seen it. I'm a big fan of Egon Schiele, so yes, I know.
Yes, yes. Like, is that almost a sort of Austrian
Fantastic.
secessionist picture in the background there? I don't know. But
no, actually, it is. It's inspired by a Klimt. It's a much more recent Russian painting, but it's inspired by a Klimt. So yeah, well spotted there. My goodness. So we've had a comment from someone who says they love your humility. So that's probably going to really embarrass you and make you even more. Oh no.
Well, school of hard knocks. I think nothing more to it than that.
But I think it's the same. I think, you know, this whole belief that writers just write and then they get published and it's all great. And it's such a hard slog. It's such hard work. And I remember meeting my first author friend at a Society of Authors event and suddenly feeling like I'd entered a world where other people spoke my language, that somebody understood what it was like to be a writer, because all my friends just thought it was a bit weird. And what are you doing? You know, well, that's not a real job, get a real job kind of thing. And to suddenly meet someone else who spent their life researching dead people and felt like they were living in this past with other people, and then, you know, being really passionate about their writing, it's fascinating. So I think it's great that, you know, you did that apprenticeship and you did that through the medium of your friend at university. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, the crucial thing is for anyone listening, as you say, who's writing themselves, is I think you've got to enjoy the process. That if I didn't enjoy the process and it had simply been a kind of a goal without a passion, to use a bit of a cliche, then I think it would have been harder to keep going. But you know, I loved writing the book, so I figured I'll just keep going and keep trying to improve. And yeah, that definitely was a sop against the rejections, which inevitably began to mount up over that period.
So tell us what you were studying and what you were intended to be before you became a writer.
Well, I studied French and Italian at university, which in fact does end up feeding into the first novel that I got published 10 years after I left university. But I then joined ITV as my first job. I enjoyed football, and I saw a job advertised in The Guardian in the media jobs page, again, hard copies, the early noughties. And it was just at a time when Match of the Day had transferred to ITV. I don't know, you have to cast your mind back, but Des Lynam had defected. It was was going to be adverts. It was a huge sort of huge moment, and as a result, ITV were looking for new recruits, and I just was very lucky in seeing that ad at that moment, and so that was my first job after university, and I wrote while I was doing that job, and then I had a kind of a moment of panic about 4 years later, where I suddenly thought, you know, the novel writing is not turning me into Dan Brown at the moment. And much as I love working in TV, I wasn't sure it was going to be my long-term future. So I followed what a lot of my friends had done, and I trained to become a lawyer, went over to the dark side. And that seemed like a serious thing to do. But in the end, just before going on to practice, I managed to get a book published. So, or at least get an agent, which led to getting a book published. So I never ended up practicing as a lawyer. But again, I used that experience in my first novel, which was about a lawyer. So another kind of apprenticeship, with all of which ended up feeding into the writing.
So I was going to ask you about that, because your crime writing is the first novel was The Shadow of the Rock. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So this is about the character with the fabulous name of Spike Sanguinetti. What a great name! Tell us about Spike and where he came from. We know some of it now because we know that you studied law, and I assumed that was where he'd come from. But tell us about how he came about and what he does and where he lives.
Well, Spike is a Gibraltarian, and I'd become a bit fascinated with Gibraltar because it was a chance visit there. I think just after I left university, but a friend who is now a lawyer, even a partner at a city law firm, which I may be embarrassing him now because it was an act of enormous incompetence by him, which led to us going to Gibraltar. He was going to go on holiday to Brazil, and so he booked himself onto a Spanish course in Granada in southern Spain, unaware that in fact they didn't speak Spanish at all in Brazil, which was yes. And he got there on day one, and his sort of classmates were all asked, why are you learning Spanish? And he said, well, I'm going to Brazil next month. I want to, I really want to blend in with the locals. And everyone started laughing, and he didn't know why. So he fled the course and said, I'm stuck here for a week in southern Spain. Is anyone free to join me? We'll go on a driving trip or something. I'll hire the car. He's very ashamed. I was free, so I went out and joined him, flew out to Malaga, and he picked me up in a Fiat Punto, and the two of us drove around Andalusia, and we just picked names off a map that I suppose were famous, Cadiz and Torremolinos, I'm ashamed to say, but we also went to Gibraltar, and it was a strange and sort of unsettling experience, because I had a sort of a vision of what it would be like. I thought it would be either there'd be Brits there or there would be Spaniards there, but all the names on the sort of plaques on the doors were Italian, and this is where I sort of fed into my Italian. And I didn't understand why Gibraltar would be full of Italians. It seemed completely baffling. So I started to read about it afterwards and learnt about the fact that a huge number of Genoese had come over to Gibraltar during the Napoleonic Wars, and they'd settled there, and they worked sort of tending to the British garrison, and as a result the largest ethnic group in Gibraltar are Genoese Italians. So Spike Sanguinetti, the sort of Italian surname with blood attached to it, and maybe cool calmness, that really grabbed me. And it's a real name in Gibraltar, quite a common name. And so yes, and then during my law course I found out that the highest proportion per capita of lawyers in any town on earth was in Gibraltar. So wow. These two things collided, lawyers, Gibraltar, and I began to wonder what it might be like to be a lawyer there. And I even went and talked to a few lawyers, slightly suggesting I might go on and practice there, but in reality sort of hoarding information to create the background for this character.
You always knew that you were going to write about this character in Gibraltar.
Yeah, I thought I saw possibilities there. I mean, I think that the great thing about the law in Gibraltar is that you work both as a barrister and a solicitor. So you're on your feet in court with your wig, but you're also doing property disputes and conveyancing and crime, and huge range. So as a character, Spike could get involved in any walk of life. And then you've got Africa below, Europe above, Spain, Britain, and it was this sort of nexus of Africa and Europe, and so all sorts goes on there, and it lets Spike have many adventures.
Brilliant. And so you went back several times while you were researching, because you seem to know Gibraltar very well. I don't know if you just went there on a short trip and really managed to absorb things, but it seemed to me, I'd actually wondered if you'd lived there, because you seem to really know it well.
I did. I went back a lot, and in fact I'd kind of sketch out the plot of a book and then try and visit all the places Spike visits, so, and then take notes, and it was a way of really finding those little details to bring the scenes to life. So regular visits, and it is a very small place. It's the size of Hyde Park in London, if you discount the Rock, the parts of it that no one can live on because it's so steep. So it's a quite manageable place to walk around and really get a sense of. And it also has a potential claustrophobia that fans of Agatha Christie, I think, would enjoy, in the sense of a kind of closed environment. Could be a boat on the Nile, or a snowed-in country house, or a train. But this was this entire working town or territory. So huge possibilities for stories there.
And have you had feedback from Gibraltarians? I mean, they must be thrilled. I'm hoping that you've written about it. Did they invite you out, and have you kind of done events there and things?
Yes. I've been to the Gibraltar Literary Festival a couple of times, which was excellent. And yeah, the feedback has been good. I think that, the sort of review I dreaded the most, beyond, even if the books were lucky enough to be reviewed in the Sunday Times a few times, which was something my parents read, and that was potentially a scary one. But the one I always looked out for the most was the Gibraltar Chronicle, because I had a great fear of them, Gibraltarians picking holes in the story or finding it, badly put together. But thankfully, the reviews were good. So that was when I would, heave the largest sigh of relief.
I know exactly what you mean. When my biography of Charles Dickens's artist daughter came out, the people I was most scared of was the Dickens Fellowship. And when I got a good review, and then somebody said that it was the first time they'd actually believed a particular point in Dickens' history was reading my book, I felt like I'd won an Oscar. It was like, forget the independent thought. It was, oh, thank God, the Dickens Fellowship like it. So yes, it's vitally important. The Gibraltar Chronicle is huge in Gibraltar, but it liked it. So yes. That's fantastic.
It's also Britain's second oldest newspaper as well.
Yeah,
or second oldest English language newspaper. Sorry,
it's actually a really interesting place, Gibraltar, and I thought, gosh, what a great place to have set your characters. And because you've got all that little kind of up and down and the kind of alleyways going around, it's very confusing when you're there if you don't know the way. And at the beginning of The Shadow of the Rock, you've got a character running around and catching another one as he comes, cuts sideways through somewhere. And I thought, what a great place to set chase scenes, actually.
Yes, really, it's incredibly atmospheric behind. I don't know if anyone listening has been to Gibraltar, but there's a tourist area. Cruise ships arrive, people have a walk around Main Street, go to see the Barbary macaques, or the apes as they're known, and which is great and fascinating. But up sort of in the foothills of the rock above the town is a very, very old labyrinth of narrow streets, which feels more like North Africa than anywhere else. And that I loved wandering around there, and it was very, as you say, very atmospheric. And if you know where you are, there are many shortcuts, and there are passages and steps. And in fact, an animator from Gibraltar enjoyed that beginning of the novel and made a little cartoon of Spike in the dark in these in these narrow streets of Gibraltar, and it was very atmospheric. I think it's the thing that our children have enjoyed the most of anything that I've produced. They couldn't believe that a real cartoon had been made of it. So.
That is amazing. I'm very, very envious. So how many novels did you write about Spike? And tell everybody. I'm going to share a link actually to some of them, but tell us about how many you've written. And
there are 5 so far in the series. I've got I can lift them up. There was Shadow of the Rock. This is the hardback, was the first one, and then Sign of the Cross. Spike heads to Malta. From Gibraltar. There are a huge number of
I haven't read
Maltese
that one.
Gibraltar.
Must read that one. Great.
Hollow Mountain. Spike back in Gibraltar. The rock is largely hollow, and the Romans called it Mons Calpe, which means the hollow mountain. It's full of tunnels and caves. It's made of limestone, so it's an odd kind of paradox that people think of. I mean, there's even a phrase as solid as the rock of Gibraltar, which an insurance company used, but in fact it's a hollow place. So that, you know, sort of metaphors there. And then there's sleeping dogs when Spike adventures in Corfu, and then 1,000 Cuts, which has a sort of historical element with events of World War II, where Ian Fleming was stationed in Gibraltar, as it happens then, but events of World War II reverberate into the present day. So many adventures for Spike, and they were great to write.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to move on because I'm actually finding it really fascinating, but I think we need to move on to the new one. So you've reinvented yourself. Obviously, you're a crime writer, and this has a great crime kind of thriller, I should say, aspect to it. But now you're a historical novelist as well. Why the name change to TL instead of Thomas? Was that your agent's decision, or was it just that you felt you wanted it to be recognized in a different way?
That was the publisher's decision. I think they wanted the crime novels to be slightly separated off from the historical novels. So it was, I suppose, suggesting that, or marking the change in genre with a slight change in name. So the initials have appeared. I've joined the JK world. in the only way I've joined the JK world.
So tell us about this. This is I just want to say, everyone, this is such a good read. I've really, really enjoyed this. And it's a historical novel, but it's also just a travel novel. It's a novel with mystery. Great idea. So tell everybody about The Plant Hunter and how it came about, why you decided to move into historic writing.
Well,
sorry, Amber just asked, what is the book title again, please, when Spike heads to Malta?
That's Sign of the Cross. Sign of the Cross. It's probably the most violent of the Sanguinetti oeuvre. So I hope, if you, particularly the opening, if you've got if you can handle a crime novel that has a sort of rather shocking beginning. Spike is very much on the side of the angels, but there's a very unpleasant antagonist in there, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Sounds a bit scary for me.
I hope it's a little grisly, shall we say.
Okay, great. So tell us about the Plant Hunter, and we'll come on. Please do put questions in the chat, everybody, and we'll come back to some of the Spike ones later.
Yeah, the Plant Hunter, just it kind of the material grabbed me, and I left me with no choice but to write the novel, which again sounds like a bit of a cliche, but it was very true. I'd given a talk at a retirement home in Chelsea. We live in Battersea, and our kids go to a Church of England school in over the River Thames in Chelsea. And through that, I met someone who worked or volunteered at a Chelsea retirement home, providing entertainment on a Thursdays talks, and she said, "Would you like to come in and talk about the Spike Sanguinetti books?" And I said, "Yeah, well, you know, Sign of the Cross is a bit grisly," and she said, "Good, then they'll love it." So I went and gave the talk, and they were a brilliant audience, full of very interested people who'd led fascinating lives. And then afterwards, I stayed on, and you know, we had some tea and biscuits, and the lady said, "Would you like to come back in a fortnight? We've got another talk. Maybe, you know, you could catch up with the people you've met." And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." So I came back, and not necessarily expecting the talk to be, you know, riveting. I thought it would be enjoyable, but I was completely riveted. It was a talk about Chelsea through the ages, and the local historian, and she put up a slide when we got to the mid-Victorian time of the King's Road, which I knew well. I'm sure many of the listeners know well as a centre of, you know, fashion and 60s glamour, and but the King's Road was rammed with plant nurseries, as many as 25 different plant nurseries at one point. And I knew the Chelsea Flower Show was associated with Chelsea, but I also knew that hadn't arrived in the borough until 1912. So I was very curious about these nurseries and what sort of, funded them, how they got their stock. So that led me to start reading about plant hunters. And I mean, just the phrase plant hunter initially I found curious, because I'd imagined hunting as something, sneaking up on something that didn't want to be caught. And, here was it almost seemed vaguely comic. I could visualize the sort of Victorian in a pith helmet sneaking up on a geranium. And it seemed bizarre. So I read about the plant hunters almost with a sense of the absurd in my mind. And then what I found was completely the opposite. These, Indiana Jones-like figures who had traveled to very dangerous places and found very rare plants, which they then brought back to these nurseries on the King's Road and sold for huge sums of money. So it was utterly intriguing, and I started to read more and more about it, and then thought that there's a novel here.
But I've heard about them, but I did not know anything about the detail. And it really was an adventurous thing to do. I mean, you joked about the pith helmet and the geranium, but of course they were going into incredibly hostile territories, going through, they had to get past all the scary animals and things to get, not to mention the scary humans, to get to these incredible plants. I mean, of course, today, if you go traveling, there's this terrible fear of biosecurity, and you mustn't have a plant that's not indigenous, and we should rip out everything that was brought back by these Victorian hunters. But what an extraordinary thing it was in a pre-internet, pre-television age to bring people something from somewhere so exotic. I mean, most of us are very lucky. We've traveled, we've seen amazing things. But when you were writing about the ferns in this, for example, and I thought, wow, I know there was a huge Victorian craze for them and there were fern gardens. But the thought of something coming from somewhere like New Zealand to England, to me, is just mind-blowing. And
it is, and it almost more than that. It was, I think, 80% of all the plants we have in England have their origins abroad, and it was the sense that the plants that today we completely take for granted and are seen as not particularly exciting, a begonia, a jasmine, mahonia, hyacinths, the things that you might buy from a petrol station, a lupin. I mean, the list goes on, and now they are just everyday. But 150 years ago, they were rare, precious trinkets that people would literally die to find. I mean, one of the first plant hunters I read about, David Douglas, whose name we all know now from the Douglas fir, but he introduced over 200 new species to the UK, and he did die on his travels. He went when he was 35 to Hawaii looking for a particular type of screw pine tree, and he fell into a cattle pit which had been dug to trap wild cattle, but unfortunately there was a bullock still alive at the bottom of the pit, and it gored him to death and trampled him to death. And that was the end of David Douglas at 35. And then the Horticultural Society, which had sent him out there to find plants, then found their next victim or adventurer, and Robert Fortune, and then he was then dispatched to China and had extraordinary adventures. So it was a life or death profession, and the rewards were immense. And we all owe these guys a debt, really, in that they completely transformed the gardening, the horticultural landscape in the UK. I mean, there were only 3 three indigenous pine or conifers in the UK. I think the Scots pine, the common juniper, and the yew tree. And David Douglas brought huge numbers of conifers over from America. And these, we see our country as full of different types of pine tree, but that simply wasn't the case before. So you changed everything about the gardens and parks and even the natural world around us. Sometimes not for good, but largely I think for variety and fascination, for very much for good.
Yeah, I remember going to the Isles of Scilly a few years ago and going to the gardens at Tresco, which I can recommend thoroughly. It's amazing. And they had extraordinary things that I'd only ever seen in Australia and places. And it's because ships would come back and people like Joseph Banks would know that this was, a really in a mild climate compared to the rest of the UK. And so they would keep things there to propagate them. And then these amazing gardens grew up. And it's extraordinary to think that these things gathered from all over the world on this little island. Most people have never been to the Isles of Scilly. Most people outside the UK have never heard of them. But it's incredible that they brought them back so carefully. So tell us about, because I loved the way you had your main character collect these. So tell us about the main character, first of all. Harry Compton, how did he come about? Was he based on a historic figure? Was he a composite, or did he just come into your head fully formed?
No, it took a long time to come up with him, because I wanted the main character to have similar adventures to some of the real life plant hunters, but by and large, the people who were chosen and dispatched either by commercial nurseries on the King's Road or elsewhere, or by botanical institutions like Kew or the Chelsea Physic Garden or Botanic Gardens of Glasgow. These were experts, botanists. So I wanted the reader to be able to empathize with Harry in a way, and I wanted to empathize him in a way that he didn't have this expertise, but nevertheless he had a chance to embark on one of these trips. So I toyed with the idea of simply having a fully fledged Indiana Jones like character as the main character, but it didn't sort of sit right for the type of book I wanted to write. So Harry had to be, if you like, an everyman, in the sense that we could all put ourselves in his shoes, but he had to get into a position where he embarked on this journey. So that was where the idea of having him working in a plant nursery. I've got a picture. This was one of the nurseries from the King's Road.
Wow.
Knight and Perry. So you can imagine just how beautiful it must have been to walk up and down that road, these incredible glass houses, inspired by the great exhibition in London. So Harry works in one of these ornate glass houses, and you can imagine it's very hot and sweaty, and it was very cool and trendy place to be, in the sense perhaps similar to the Mary Quant days of King's Road in the 60s, in that the plants themselves were so desirable. So he is a very handsome young man, and he's been given this job selling plants because he's almost as beautiful as some of the plants he's selling. And but what he really wants to be doing is working to propagate the plants and look after them, and not simply be working as a showman or a salesman. But to get him from there onto his adventure, he's bequeathed a map of which denotes the location of a hugely valuable and beautiful tree called the icicle tree in the depths of the interior of China. And the man who gives him the map, I don't want to give any spoilers away, is himself a plant hunter, but Harry helps him, and he gives him this map before he dies. And as a result, this gives Harry a chance to say, right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to try and find this plant myself. But he's a little naive at this point, and so others find out about what he has, and he ends up as this kind of race to find the plant with others looking for it. But he has to learn as he goes, and he gets into some terrible scrapes. And in China, he's taken under the wing of a widow, a beautiful, prickly widow who lives in Shanghai, and she's English as well. And she looks after him a bit, and he looks after her a bit, and together they kind of learn about what they're doing as they plunge down the River Yangtze into more and more dangerous scenarios.
Stop you there because I don't want you getting any spoilers.
Right.
But honestly, this is a great read. So was it as dangerous? I mean, as in, was it as cutthroat, and was the rivalry that deadly? Or did you put that in for great kind of authorial comment? Or do you think they really did vie this much with each other?
I think that there was certainly quite territorial plant hunters. If certain well-known plant hunters had areas that if someone else strayed into it, they were could get upset. But I think I think it was more the dangers that awaited you when you were there, and also the very real possibility of failure. I mean, that the story was inspired partly by a guy called E.H. Wilson, or Ernest Wilson, a real life man who, I've got another picture here.
Brilliant.
He got these giant pictures. He was sent to find a tree called the handkerchief tree, which yes. I don't know, maybe you've heard of, or
I've definitely
about the place, yeah, or the dove tree, absolutely stunning. But a guy, a King's Road nurseryman called Harry Veach, had seen a dried specimen of this, which had in fact been found by a Frenchman. So here we have a bit of rivalry. The Frenchman had sent the specimen back, but had not introduced a live plant yet to Europe. So Harry Veach, who owned a nursery on the King's Road, probably the most prominent nursery, went to Kew Gardens, found this guy called Ernest Wilson, who was quite a bookish character, but a great expert in botany, and said, right, leave your job, I will pay you, get to China, find me this tree, this real tree, bring it back, and I will sell it on the King's Road and make a fortune.
And he did, probably.
And he did, but Ernest Wilson got to China, and he found a sort of guy who worked for the customs service, who had seen one of these trees that the French botanists had found, and said, I think it's roughly in this area, drew him a map, which was an area of 20,000 square miles. So it was an enormous area. But Ernest Wilson headed there, and he sort of zeroed in eventually on the X, and he found the location of this handkerchief tree. But when he got there, all he found was a tree stump. The tree had been chopped down, and about 100 yards away was a newly built house.
Oh no!
Which contained the wood from this felled handkerchief tree. It almost reminded me of a Roald Dahl story called Parson's Pleasure, which I don't know, well worth reading, but Tale of the Unexpected. So it was a most devastating moment for Ernest Wilson. He'd come all this way, and he got so close, but he did eventually, he searched, scoured the area around there, and found another handkerchief tree which had seeded from this larger one, and he managed to gather seeds and bring it back. And so, that was another real life story which played into this, the idea of searching for one particular tree, and it's something that others might feel they had ownership of, to say nothing of the locals who, at that stage, I suppose, were having their plants removed and sold at a great price, and without necessarily profiting from it themselves. These rules have changed, as you alluded to, and that is not something that can be done now. Everything is much more collaborative, as it should be. But it is of its era. So yes, the real life rivalries and dangers definitely play into the novel.
And so you mentioned, which I find really fascinating, the equipment that a plant hunter takes. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? And how did you do your research? Did you go to places like Kew? In fact, someone's asked, did you do any research at the Chelsea Physic Garden? Did you go to these places? And I really want to know if you went to China as well, because you're writing about China is so fascinating.
Yes, well, I went to I've been to the Chelsea Physic Garden a lot. For 40 quid, you can become a friend, which is in this day and age remains very good value, I think, and which means you can go as many times as you like. And with our kids are at a school which is literally a stone's throw from the Chelsea Physic Garden. So I went there a lot. And in fact, one of the plant hunters who inspired the novel, and another one, Robert Fortune, who I mentioned as a successor to David Douglas, he didn't die on his many travels, and he ended up being in charge of the Chelsea Physic Garden, curator of the Chelsea Physic Garden, and his blue plaque you can still see up in the street in Chelsea as well. So yes, I went there. Kew Gardens is fantastic. I was lucky enough to be shown around the herbarium of Kew, which is mind-boggling, and it's not always open to the public, but has millions and millions and millions of plant specimens. The majority of all the plants on Earth are stored there in form of seeds and dried specimens. So that was extraordinary, and I got to look at their plant presses and see the kit that was used. But the main bit of kit I haven't seen with my own eyes. I'd be riveted if anyone listening has. Was called a Wardian case, which was invented by a man called Dr. Ward, who was studying caterpillars at the time, and he had a kind of sealed glass case with a caterpillar in it that he was studying, and overnight a little fern grew within this case, and he was puzzled as to how it had done so well in an environment that was closed off. And the fern continued to grow and then thrived without him ever taking the lid off the sort of miniature greenhouse. And he realized that a little sort of micro environment would be created, and that live plants could be brought within what was effectively a miniature greenhouse. So these were rolled off the presses and became the plant hunter's tool of choice to collect and plant living specimens, and then place them ideally on the poop deck of a boat, so they had access to light, and then they were brought back and carried in great pomp and circumstance down the King's Road, with brand new unseen plants in them. So I definitely wanted to give Harry a Wardian case, but he has to have one made in Shanghai by a cabinet maker because he doesn't have his own. But that's that kind of kit was riveting. It was something called a vasculum, which I kept, when I was writing, I kept calling a speculum, which I think is something
very
extremely different. Don't go there. Suddenly, why is the word speculum in my book? Oh God, a vasculum was a kind of sheet metal satchel that you could wear around your neck or sling it over your shoulder, and it was hard enough to protect plant specimens and seeds that you collect, and that was also part of the gear. So you'd have your vasculum and your Wardian case and your plant press, and potentially as photography developed, you could take photos of the plants, but before then, painting was an important bit of kit, so you could show what you were collecting and what it looked like in the wild and in its natural habitat. And there's at Kew, there's an extraordinary gallery, a permanent gallery by someone woman called Marion North.
Oh, yes, it's amazing.
It's just a staggering room where they've put together all her paintings. And she was a bit of an inspiration in the novel as well, because Harry's partner in crime, Clarissa, is a painter, but she doesn't realize how capable she is of painting plants in their natural environment. So she begins to work as a painter as well. Anyway, I won't give too much away, but so, you know, the most beautiful botanical art you can see now in books, and you know, perhaps people have the odd one on their wall now. It really is it's kind of mind-blowingly beautiful genre of art which came out of this period as well.
Yeah, it just such an. Where did you go for a lot of your research, particularly about the kind of Shanghai area? Did you go out to Shanghai and did you study it, or did you talk to kind of Asia House, or how did you do that?
Yeah, well, I had been to Shanghai again in the company of the same guy who got me down into Andalusia after.
Fantastic, good friend to have.
Yeah. He and I and a couple of others went to join another lawyer friend who was on secondment in Shanghai, and his law firm had very luckily given him a flat to live in central Shanghai. So for Christmas and New Year, a group of us went down there and had a riot. It was great fun, and I had a kind of a slightly confusing first night, which was on Christmas Eve. We all arrived at the flats, left our passports and bags, and then headed out into this extraordinary, you know, sort of modern neon city, Blade Runner come to life. And I became separated from the group due to overexcitement, but then I couldn't find the flat, which I knew was near the Crown Plaza Hotel. I thought that was information enough, but it turned out there were 5 Crown Plaza hotels in Shanghai. And by the time we got to the third, I had sort of almost given up hope, and everyone had turned their phones off. I tried to check into the Crown Plaza Hotel, but you need a passport in China to check into a hotel, so that was completely not allowed. So I was basically on Christmas Eve, very cold. I had to either sleep rough or find somewhere to bed down. So I found an apartment block which sort of looked like my friend's, but I knew deep down it wasn't. And in the lobby there was a sofa, and it had quite a big gap underneath it. It was a shag pile carpet under the sofa, and an area that I thought I could climb into. So I was worried if I slept on the sofa, I might be arrested or moved on. So I decided to climb under the sofa, and I fell asleep on Christmas Eve there. But I'm quite tall, 6'3", and my feet were sticking out. And the concierge came back in and found my feet sticking out, and pulled them. And then I woke up with a start, and the sofa leapt into the air and then fell down and hit my shins. It was quite painful. And I climbed out, and he was distraught and sort of uneasy as to who I was. And I couldn't speak Mandarin, and he couldn't speak English. But eventually we sat, and he was incredibly kind, gave me a hot glass of sort of hot, sweet water. And we sat sort of talking on Christmas Eve. And he in his language, me in mine. And I don't know what we talked about, but eventually the sun came up, and my friend turned on his phone, and I could finally get back. But that moment of being completely lost in Shanghai, it's a complete dislocation. And I knew that I wanted to send Harry to Shanghai to experience that kind of culture shock. So if that's research, it's a strange sort of research, but
I think it's hilarious research. I love it. Well done. Much better than the normal going out and going to a library. But you evoke it. I've not actually been to Shanghai, and you evoke it so well. It's made me really want to go. I found it fascinating the way that you were writing that. I've read about British life in China at that time, and I just thought it was really intriguing. So yeah, this is a great novel. I really do recommend it to you all, The Plant Hunter. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm going to come back in a minute and ask you what you're working on next. We've got one question before I tell everybody what's coming up next on Goldster that you haven't answered yet, which is how much were you involved in what were on the book covers?
Yeah, I mean, a bit for the Plant Hunter cover. I've got a copy there. I was sort of puzzled. I don't know, you probably can't see it that well, but this was actually made. It was an embroidered flower that was put together. The publisher found an illustrator, a French lady called Adèle Léris, and she embroidered this flower of the icicle tree, because the icicle tree is a fictional plant that I made up, because if I chose a real plant, it probably would have a plant hunter's name attached to it. So I realized I had to sort of, like Dr. Frankenstein, make my own beautiful tree. So it was described in the novel, and the illustrator was given the description from the novel. And then she embroidered this flower, which was then photographed and used as part of, superimposed on top of a map. Anyway, all this had been done and then was shown to me. And even if I'd not liked it, I would have felt extremely churlish to say, nah, do something else. But as it happened, I thought it was absolutely beautiful. So I was shown the various stages along the way, and I kind of nodded and gave massive thumbs up and said, yes, please do that. So there was not really input, but encouragement, I would say. For the Spike novels, a little more input. I mean, the ones I'd flashed up there were the American covers. The British ones have different covers, but there was one, the cover of, hold on, I'll grab it. Yes, the paperback, small paper, mass market paperback for the first novel. This figure here, in one of its early incarnations, was a sort of larger looking guy, and he was carrying a briefcase, and he looked slightly like an estate agent running late for a meeting. And unlike a sort of Spike is a sort of rather cool looking lawyer who throws himself into action. So I was, I say maybe we could lose the briefcase and let's have him a bit more sort of lean and mean looking as a figure. So there were small tweaks in terms of covers, but mainly, I'm just thrilled with what the publisher had come up with, and cheered from the sidelines, and certainly remembering the many books in my desk drawer and thinking, I'm so lucky to have these books out there. Let's go for it. The cover looks great. So.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute. I'm going to tell everybody what we're going to do next, and then I really want you to talk to us about what you're working on now, if you're happy to do that.
Yeah.
So just so that everybody knows, I'm back again on next week on Thursday. I'm very excited. If you look on the Goldster website, I'm going to be interviewing one of my absolute kind of teenage icons, who is Nigel Planer, who you probably best know as Neil the hippie from The Young Ones. He was one of the original comic strip presents, and he's a very talented playwright. I've seen actually a couple of his plays performed on the stage. Really interesting that he's written so much. I think people don't realize how much he's written. He's also writing a novel at the moment called Jeremiah Born in Time, which is already available on Audible, which I find really fascinating as a performance, but he's writing it as a novel as well. So that is on the 14th of April. And then the 15th, next Friday, we've got Inside Story with Humphrey, and he is interviewing the American author Austin S. Camacho. What a great name. From the heart of Washington, D.C., he's the author of Hannibal Jones' Private Detective series, and it's going to be really great. Humphrey is very much looking forward to that one, I know. And then Humphrey's back again next Friday with a cookery writer this time, the author of Amazing Malaysian, Norman Musa. And it says, join us for a culinary delight in the exotic Orient. It's going to be really fascinating. And also, as you probably know, this month, Humphrey's doing Book of the Month, last Friday of the month, for which you should be reading, and I hope you're all reading, Candide by Voltaire. He's making you very intellectual this month. And then next month, just so that you know, I'm doing one of the Persephone books. Do you remember we talked to Nicola Bowman from Persephone Books a few weeks ago? And so for the Book of the Month in May, we're going to be reading Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day. So you've got Voltaire and then Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day next month as well. So we've got lots of great things coming up. And I just want to tell you about the PPG. For those of you who don't know about PPG, it's our Tuesday lunchtime slot, which is Purpose, Passion, Grit. I'm one of 4 presenters on that. And on Tuesday, I'm going to be interviewing Sasha Bates, who is actually an author as well, but she's coming on in her capacity as a grief counsellor and therapist. And she's written 2 books called The Languages of Loss and The Grief Companion, which were inspired by her own work as a psychotherapist, and sadly by the fact that she was widowed very young when her husband died very suddenly. So it's really amazing books, and she's just fantastic. So I've got a couple more questions coming in. Let me just check these. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for those lovely messages from everybody. Very interesting session. Thank you. And Amber, I will have a look for your recommendation. Thank you very much for that recommendation. She's recommended another author to invite for another Inside Story. So thank you very much for that. So Thomas, quickly, we've got 3 minutes. What can you tell us about what you're working on right now?
Well, the clue is contained in this little bottle.
Saffron? Is that saffron?
It is, yes, it is. There are other Spike books I've sort of got sketched out, but I've been pulled into another historical and vaguely botanical story, which is inspired by the knowledge that in the 17th and 16th century, the biggest producer of saffron in the world was England, which seems, again, it almost like finding out that Gibraltar was full of Italians, or that the King's Road had 25 nurseries on it at one point or another in the mid and early 1800s. It was one of those sort of bits of information that surprised me. I wanted to find out more, and I was sort of saffron as coming from the Middle East or hotter parts of the Mediterranean, and so it's Saffron Walden is one of the important parts of the story.
And Saffron Hill, of course, in London, I suppose there's lots of places with saffron in the name, which should give us a clue. Yeah. Yes,
yeah, where Saffron Hill, where Fagin's gang operated out of, but that was in the past. Yeah, the Bishop of Ely grew his saffron there, I believe. So Saffron Walden was the main hub. Huge, lucrative industry. So it's connected to that, and I'm writing it at the moment. And so back in the world, well, your world, Lucinda, of historical research, and thoroughly enjoying it.
It's great. I love doing research, and it's wonderful to absorb yourself in a whole other time. But the rabbit holes you go down when you find one interesting thing and it takes you off, it's quite difficult to pull yourself back in sometimes. But I think every book engenders another. Everything you write about links you to something else. So do come back and talk to us when that one's out, please. It's been lovely. I
would love to. I'd love to. Yeah, sort of carving out a niche of botanical themed historical adventure novels.
Well, they're as good as this one. I love this one. Here it is again. Last time, The Plant Hunter, T.L. Mogford, you have to look up for. Do look it up. Ask in your local bookshop. I've put the link to bookshop.org to Thomas's book there. And of course, go to your local bookseller if you want to. And is it available on Kindle as well, Thomas? It's available.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you everyone for listening, watching, and showing the interest. It's hugely appreciated.
Brilliant. Well, we've got one here saying plants are eternally fascinating. Such a great session. Thank you. Brilliant, everyone. Well, Thomas and I are now going to turn off our videos, and I think Stephanie or Ben is going to put up a little poll. Thank you so much, Thomas. I'll say goodbye to you now, and as I say, come back again. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.
I'll see you all on Thursday with Nigel Planer, for which I shall be very overexcited. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.